Theda Bara, Mary Pickford, Louise Brooks, Lillian Gish, Clara Bow, and Marion Davies. When someone says silent movie star, these are some of the names and the faces that may pop into your mind. But so many more actresses seem to have been forgotten. Why? Some may have left their careers on screen behind, opting to have what was called a more normal life, wanting to settle down and raise a family, far away from the studios. Others, sadly, had their careers cut short, and sometimes their lives, to accident or illness, to addiction or depression, scandal, and yes, even in rare cases, murder. In a new series on this channel, as a silent movie fan myself, I want to rediscover some of these actresses. What happened to them? Where did they go? Why did they leave? Some you may have heard of, others you may have not, and sadly, many would be remembered for how they died and not for the work they left behind. Some of the actresses I researched, the history is hard to find, but by going through old newspapers and genealogical research, I hoped to find some answers. And sadly, with many, a lot of their movies are lost, and only a few photos remain. The first actress I want to explore is the British actress Lillian Hall-Davis. Lillian was born June 23, 1898 at Mile End in London. Father, Charles Burrell Davis, who was a London taxi driver, and mother, Lillian Ketterman, had 4 children in total. Lillian being the eldest, followed by her sister Ada Doreen, then would come her brother Henry Charles, followed by the youngest, her little sister Ivy. Not much is known about Lillian's childhood, but what is known is she found herself to the stages of the London theaters while as a teenager, and she must have been pretty good. Because it is said a few years later, French director René Herville attended one of Lillian's performances and cast her in what would be her first movie in 1917, a French film called La Petite du Sixième. After filming in France, she returned to the theater stages of London. And it wouldn't be until 1918 when she was cast in her next film, a British comedy called The Admirable Crichton, which was based on a very popular play of the time. 1918 would also be the year she would meet Walter Pemberton, and in July of that year, they would marry in Lambeth, London. Her next film would be 1919's The Better Ole, and while filming, she found herself to be pregnant. And on June 10, 1919, she gave birth to her one and only child, a son, named Grosvenor Charles Pemberton. Between 1920 and 1921, she would make only 3 films: The Honey Pot and Ernest Maltravers, both in 1920, and in 1921 she filmed Love Maggie. 1922 would be a slightly busier year for Lillian, as she would make 6 films, including Brown Sugar and Stable Companions. In 1923, the roles kept coming, and she would make 9 films that year, and she would start to get higher billing, including the movie Royal Divorce, the story of Josephine and Napoleon. Lillian played the part of Stephanie de Beauharnais. Her role in Royal Divorce made her a star with the British audiences. But one film that she would make that year would be very controversial and caused outrage from the British Board of Film Censors. The movie was Married Love. The book, which the movie was based on, was written by British birth control campaigner Dr. Marie C. Stopes. One of the subjects of her book that was turned into this film is what was said to be glorification of free love. And the other problem they had with the film? Dr. Stopes also wrote the screenplay. Another controversial sequence in the film, Lillian's character attempts to take her own life. The controversy surrounding the film must have worked, for in 1924 a big role landed at her feet. She would star as Lucia in Quo Vadis, playing a beautiful Christian hostage that a young pagan general falls in love with. Filming wouldn't be without tragedy, however, for on the set a lioness escaped during filming over a protective barrier and killed an elderly extra. Quo Vadis was a very successful film, and Lillian's role in it gained her the attention of American audiences, and her popularity grew. Overseas, American newspapers were calling her one of the most beautiful actresses ever to grace the screen. She even saw her wage increase to $150 per week. Seems a bit small, but convert that to 2023 money with inflation, and you're looking at over $2,600 per week, or close to $11,000 per month. Lillian would be busy between 1924 and 1927, making 16 films in total. She also went to Germany to film, and there she would work with some of their biggest stars. Names such as Lil Dagover, Ozzy Oswalda, and Conrad Veidt. Lillian also returned to France to star in a few French films. Other films this year included Roses of Picardy and Boadicea, based on the story of Boudica, the warrior queen. Her roles since Quo Vadis also gained the attention and the eye of an up-and-coming writer and director. You would know him as Alfred Hitchcock. So in 1927, he would cast her as the girl in his film The Ring, starring opposite of Carl Brisson and Ian Hunter. She would next star in 1928's The White Sheik, opposite of popular actor and heartthrob Warwick Ward, and she also co-starred with Jameson Thomas. But Hitchcock wasn't done with Lillian yet. He would cast her opposite of her White Sheik co-star Jameson Thomas in 1928's The Farmer's Wife. An article in a 1928 newspaper describes the film. Desperate to marry again, widowed farmer Samuel Sweetland, played by Jameson Thomas, sits down with his housekeeper, Minta, played by Lillian Hall-Davis, and writes a list of prospective brides. The next step? To convince one of these women to marry him. Samuel, in increasingly absurd comedic situations, is rejected again and again, until finally realizing the perfect woman was right in front of him the whole time. Lillian gives such a great performance in this film, and some say it's one of her best roles. You laugh along with the comedic talent, and you weep along with her tears. Although Lillian was in demand and at the height of her career, she only made 4 films in 1928. The other 2 films she would make is Tommy Atkins and Volga Volga. Unknown to her co-stars and those around her, Lillian was suffering from depression and neurasthenia, which is comparable to chronic fatigue syndrome. As a result, Lillian had a complete nervous breakdown, and she went under a doctor's care for treatment and to get some rest. When Lillian made her return to the screen, it would be in 1930s Just for a Song as its star, but now the movies had moved into the sound era. And just as with so many actors and actresses, Lillian found the transition very hard from the silent movie screen to sound. And this seemed to make her depression even worse. She would only make 2 more movies, both in 1931. Her Reputation, which she was in a supporting role, But her last film, Many Waters, she again would be the star. After filming, Lillian, her husband Walter, and their young son moved to the Golders Green area of London where her brother worked, and so she could be closer to him. And although she was falling more into despair and her depression was getting worse, she kept it hidden. But it was in October of 1933 when she was having a visit with her neighbor and friend Lily Bernard, having a nice chat. Then the conversation turned dark, when Lillian expressed out of the blue how she would just end her life by putting her head into the gas oven. Lillian, obviously seeing the shock on Lily's face, quickly followed with, "Oh, I would never do such a thing," and she changed the subject immediately. A few days later, on October 25th, Grosvenor, her 14-year-old son, came home from school and found a note from his mother that simply said, "The kitchen door is locked. Don't try to get in, but go over to the road to Mrs. Bernard." He did just as his mother said, and he ran over to the road and handed the note to Mrs. Bernard, Lily. Lily, remembering the conversation she had with Lillian a few days earlier, told Grosvenor to stay put as she ran over to the house. As soon as she got there, she could smell the gas. She tried to get through the kitchen door, but when she couldn't, she ran over and got another neighbor, Herbert French, to come over and help her. When he too failed at trying to break through the kitchen door, Lily told him to go run and get his hammer. When he got back, Lily grabbed the hammer from his hands and ran to the outside of the kitchen window and smashed it in. The smell of the escaping gas was overwhelming. As Lily climbed through the window, Herbert looked over her shoulder and saw with horror Lillian lying on the floor with her head in the oven and a deep wound on her neck. Clasped in her right hand was a flat, straight razor. Lillian was, of course, unresponsive, so they immediately called the police, and a Constable Putt showed up on the horrifying scene. He knew she was already gone, but in turn he called a Dr. Temple Gray to the house, and he confirmed it. Lillian was dead. Lillian's husband Walter, during all this, was in London on business, and he wouldn't find out the horrible news until he got home. A coroner's inquest was held into Lillian's death shortly afterwards. The coroner interviewed many witnesses. He interviewed Lily Bernard, who gave an account of the conversation she had with Lillian, where she described how she would end it all. He asked Mrs. Bernard if she believed Lillian would take her own life. Lily replied, "No," as within 5 minutes she seemed all right, and she said she would never do such a thing. Then Lily described the events leading up to finding her friend's body. Next to be interviewed would be Henry, Lillian's brother, who worked as a post office engineer at Golders Green. He confirmed the note left for Grosvenor was in his sister's handwriting, and sadly, he also confirmed the razor Lillian used as his. He also put on record that his sister never talked about taking her own life and never attempted it before. Next to be interviewed would be Lillian's other neighbor, Herbert French, and Constable Putt. Then he interviewed Dr. Gray. He was asked if Lillian's main cause of death was the gas. He said no. It was the razor cut to her own throat. The coroner then recorded his verdict. Lillian Hall-Davis died as a result from a self-inflicted wound to the neck, and she was of unsound mind. Lillian was only 35. Sadly, if anyone does remember the name Lillian Hall-Davis, it would be more for the circumstances surrounding her death than for her work in movies and how she lived. She was a talented theater actress that graced the stages of London, and later, she would light up the big screens in theaters across the world. It would be nice if we could remember her that way.